Welcome to The Definitive Wrap, where we report the truth about American exceptionalism. We love our flag, we love our country, and we believe in America. The Definitive Wrap, where we respect people of faith, the men and women in blue, and our support for Israel. And now your hosts, Bela Sebro, she's the nice one, and Alan Skorsky. He's not so nice. But together they are The Definitive Wrap.
I'm Alan Skorsky with my co-host Bela Sebro, and thank you for tuning in to The Definitive Wrap podcast. And thank you, Vin News, for posting our shows. This week's sponsor is allshookup.com from Teaneck, New Jersey, your online store for products imported from the Shook. Use TDR in the promo code for an extra bonus on your purchases. There's a saying in politics, when something doesn't make sense or look right, follow the money. In movies, if you want excitement, we think of James Bond or Fauda. Today's guest is the James Bond and Fauda of the courtroom. Nitsana Darshan-Leitner is the CEO of the Shurat HaDin Law Center, who follows the money and sues governments who finance terrorism against Israelis and Jews and banks who launder money for terrorist groups. On their website, their motto is bankrupting terrorism one lawsuit at a time. We undertake civil actions against Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, Egypt, North Korea, UBS, and the Lebanese Canadian Bank. The cases being tried in Israeli, American, Canadian, and European jurisdictions allow the victims of terrorism to fight back. Shurat HaDin has won billions of dollars in judgments against these groups. In her fantastic book titled Harpoon, Inside the Covert War Against Terrorism's Money Masters, Nitsana gives vivid details about how the Mossad, led by Meir Dagan, were able to trace the funds used by terror groups like Hezbollah and the brilliant executions of these operations. Today, we will discuss these and other major cases taken on by Shurat HaDin. Bela?
Thank you, Alan. Today's guest represents an organization that follows the verse in the Torah, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdov, Leman Tichyeh. Justice, justice shall you pursue, so that you may live. Shurat HaDin goes on the legal offensive against Israel's enemies, and it's with tremendous wisdom that they accomplish their missions. But not with guns and knives and bombs. No, they cut off the source of their supply of money. And how do they do that? They sue them. In recent news, anti-Israel rapper Tamar Nafar, who spread anti-Israel messages, including comparing Israel to Nazis, was removed from government campaign after Shurat HaDin went to task demanding that he be removed on the basis that he is committing a civil injustice. And even more recent, it was Shurat HaDin, Israeli Law Center, that got a court order for Hamas to compensate families of 3 murdered teens. There is no end to what Shurat HaDin will do, as their slogan is bankrupting terrorism one lawsuit at a time. And with us today to talk about their successful cases is a heroic, courageous professional, Nitsana Darshan-Leitner, the CEO of the Shurat HaDin Law Center. She's an Israeli attorney, human rights activist, and the founder of Shurat HaDin Israeli Law Center. Nitsana has represented hundreds of terror victims and recovered more than $200 million in compensation on their behalf, among her many other accomplishments. Nitsana, it gives me great honor to welcome you to The Definitive Wrap.
Well, thank you, Bella. It's my pleasure, honor to be on your show.
Nitsana, please share with our audience how Shurat HaDin was started. We want to know how this organization is so successful, being tough but diplomatic. I love that.
Yeah. It's a non-violent way to fight terrorism. This is how I recognize it. Shurat HaDin was established in the beginning of Intifada. We actually started as private lawyers and just finishing up law school, and we realized that there is a way to fight terrorism by going after their pocketbooks, after the terror organizations, after their assets,
hit them in the pocket. That's it.
Right? because in the end, money is oxygen to everything, including terrorism. And if we chop off the flow of the money, we can chop off the flow of the terrorism. We started filing lawsuits against Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Authority, against Iran and Syria in the United States. And then we were approached by a secret unit in the Mossad called Harpoon. This is a unit that combines with all representatives from all the security services and intelligence services in Israel, but they have one goal: to fight terror financing. It was headed by Meir Dagan, the legendary head of the Mossad. And they saw the same thing that we saw: go after the money, kill the money. Their name was Harpoon. It was a secret unit until we wrote a book about it. And they approached us and say, maybe we can collaborate, we can work together. They will give us evidence to go after banks to provide financial services to organizations. And we agreed. We established Shurat HaDin, a non-for-profit organization, to manage all these hundreds of cases in an orderly manner in the courts around the world.
Okay, so Nitsana, I wrote down my questions for you for today, and I'm going to begin with Harpoon because you mentioned it. It is a fantastic book. It is, again,
Thank
it's
you.
James Bond and Fauda, but it's real. So I'm going to just mention 2 points from the book that stuck with me, and you can either expand on it or, add anything you like. First, it was Operation Green Lantern, and this was the height of chutzpah, but good chutzpah, where Israel's Secret Service and all their elite agencies went into Ramallah. They cordoned off a bank. They raided the bank. They took out all of their computers, and the Bush administration went nuts. I mean, this was magnificent. And then my favorite story that I loved, I was laughing. You referred to a,
they said,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
They said to President Bush told Ariel Sharon that no democratic state goes and rob a bank. It
was beautiful operation. And you know what, Bush got over it. But my favorite story is the one about Salah Ezzadin. He was a Shiite Muslim from Lebanon. Bela, this is a great story. He was a very well-to-do investor. He was very close to Hezbollah, and everybody wanted to invest with him. If he's living rich, why shouldn't we? So the way they do it in the Middle East is they travel to the Gulf states, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and they meet up with other investors. And an Israeli unit hooked up with him and said, we're investors, we can make you a lot of money. So this Muslim supporter of Hezbollah would invest money with this new investment firm, and he would get supporters of Hezbollah to invest with him. And then soon other Arabs in Lebanon, other Shiites would invest with him, and they would get returns of 40, 50, 60%. And then one day, poof, the investment firm disappeared, and they realized that they were set up. So Nitsana, I don't know if you want to talk about this in more detail. I don't know if you can, but this was one of my favorite parts of your book.
Yeah, that surprises as well. We had a front seat watching the operations of Harpoon, and although we enjoyed the fruits of Green Lantern operation, all the documentations that the Harpoon grabbed from the robbing the bank and raiding the bank fell into our hands, and we used it in legal proceedings against banks that help and aid and abet terrorism. We saw how they did the same thing with the Lebanese Mado. That's the guy in Lebanon. They just simply tricked him and got him to invest with him and made the money disappear. The same story was with Yasser Arafat when they created, again, a fake investment fund and convinced Mohammed Rashid, who was the financial advisor of Yasser Arafat, to go and just know the new investment fund. They actually rented buildings and furnitures and hired beautiful secretaries and made a whole show. Great operation from Mossad. Eventually, Mohammed Rashid agreed, invested all the money, and after a couple of months, lost it somewhere in the air. This is the brilliance of Meir Dagan in his step. He chose the right people to go and brainstorm and to come up with these ideas. The Meir Dagan, although he was a big hero, and he had a dagger between his teeth. This is how it was described by Ariel Sharon, the prime minister. Hated wars. He could not have people die in the wars. He could not have his soldiers die in the war. And he was thinking creatively, what would be a non-violent way to fight terrorism? And this is what he came up with, harpoon.
Nitsana, I understand that many of the cases are heard in U.S. courtrooms, either because victims of Palestinian shootings and bombings are Americans, and they're then with regards to the attacks or Hezbollah rockets, and many of them do hold American citizenship. But my question is, a lot of these terrorists do have militant funds in the United States, and you target those militant funds. So in your book, Harpoon, you describe how those bank accounts are targeted. So my question is, I'm very curious, where do you get your tip-offs about their finances? Like, how do you know that? Like, where do you find out?
So I just told you my secret.
I've always been wondering about that.
I told you my secret. It started with Harpoon. They, as a Mossad unit or as a intelligence unit that target terror financing, they went themselves and realized that millions and millions of dollars are making their way from Europe, from United States, into the hands of the Palestinian organizations, and they track the money. Their slogan was follow the money, target the money, kill the money. They had the information, and they found ways to whitewash this evidence, this information, and let us use it in court. Sometimes it was simply documents that they target. Sometimes it was testimonials of Mossad agents that literally went to the banks, warned them before that they are helping, aiding and abetting terror organizations, and even told them, that in the end they might find themselves in court being sued by terror victims. Sometimes this warning put an end to the accounts that this bank held. Sometimes it did not, and the bank found themselves in the bench in court being sued by terror organizations, by terror victims for hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay, Nitsana, I want to bring up a recent case, Ben & Jerry's. It was very big news here, and then it kind of faded away. There are boycotts. And then you said, you know what, if you're going to boycott Israel, then we're just going to go after your trademark. Now, there's something else I want to bring up. I don't know if you saw this because it just went viral. Ben & Jerry just sat down for an interview, and they were asked, okay, so you're boycotting parts of Israel and you're proud Jews, blah, blah, blah. But you're doing this out of principle. So let me ask you, the interviewer says, if you're acting on principle, then why are you selling to Texas and Georgia where, they're anti-abortion, they're pro-voting, and they just act like a couple of idiots? Now, here's my question. In Israel, you have Palestinian Media Watch, Itamar Marcus, who has everything. I would, and I was going to do this, I just didn't do it. I would love to go to Unilever and say, okay, you're principled people. Here is everything that we have in the Palestinian Authority. They have said they consider all of Israel occupied Palestine, but you support them. We have thousands of videos of children in kindergarten singing about the gloriousness of becoming martyrs. This is who you're, and there's a whole list. And not once, because Itamar always says when he goes to Europe or he goes to the US Congress and he shows them the information, they're all, aghast. Why is this information never used to confront people like them or Unilever? Unilever would be more embarrassed. Ben & Jerry's, they have no shame because they're always smoking pot. But certainly against a company like Unilever, this would certainly shame them.
Right. So we put this information in front of Unilever. We told them about this hypocrisy. We emphasized that, first of all, whereas Ben & Jerry's boycotts Judea and Samaria because it's so-called occupied territories, they don't boycott Tibet or Northern Cyprus or Georgia, which are also considered to be occupied countries. Where is their answer for this? How come they choose to go against the Jews and not against the Indians or the Turkish or the Kurds in other countries. Isn't it pure anti-Semitism? Unilever answer was not, we are not anti-Semites. But you touch upon a very great point, and this is what Shurat HaDin did on this matter as well. The Palestinian Authority violates human rights consistently on a daily basis. They use these children as human shields. They use them as soldiers. They use them to go on the fence. They use them, they train them. They give them weapons. They teach them how to kill just in 3 years old, 5 years old teenagers, really, really young. Not only that, they violate women's rights. They violate animal rights. They violate LGBT rights. What about all that? Shurat HaDin came up with reports, and we spread it all over the world, documenting how the Palestinian Authority violates its rights. But if you really ask for a sincere answer and you bring this up with Ben and Jerry's, you will find the same answer, the same bland surprise that they did in the interview. That's a very interesting question. Let me think about it.
Nitsana, I understand that Shurat HaDin defends against war crime allegations. Can you tell us about that, please? It's been making the news headlines.
Yeah, the Palestinian Authority found a new area that they can fight Israel on, which is the International Criminal Court, indicting Israel for war crimes, indicting IDF soldiers for war crimes. Their allegations are mainly two. One is the IDF soldiers are using excessive force against the Palestinians in their different operations. And the other one is the settlements, which is a breach of international law. Israel cannot build houses in occupied territories. Israel is not a member in the courts. They are not going to participate in this proceeding. Israel will not defend itself before the International Criminal Court for the simple reason that Israel knows it's a mock court, it's a political court. There is no intention to really dive into this issue and fairly judge Israel or the Palestinian Authority. We already see it from their decision to go into this conflict, which they lack any jurisdiction. Palestinian Authority is not a state. Israel is not a member. They have zero jurisdiction to go in, and yet they decided to take this investigation and run with it. So yet there is a need to represent Israel's cause in the court. And this is where Shurat HaDin comes in. We are coming on behalf of victims, two kinds of victims. One is the terror victims. We come and allege that the Palestinian Authority is actually inciting to terrorism. They have the policy of pay to slay, where they pay awards for committing acts of terrorism against innocent people. They pay them money. They pay stipends to the families of the suicide bombers. They are endorsing terrorism, which is a violation of international law.
Right.
And the other type of victims are those who was living in Judea and Samaria, in the Gush Etzion area, in the old city, prior to 1948, were departed from their houses, expelled from their houses when Jordan took over this part of Israel, the territories, the West Bank, and came back after 1967 when Israel took over control again. These victims, their rights will be violated if the court will rule that their houses actually belong to a Palestinian state or part of the Palestinian state. Being representing victims, we have a right to take part in the legal proceedings in the court. And we're waiting for the new prosecutor that just went into office a couple of months ago to decide whether he continues with this fruitless investigation, which really has zero basis to continue.
Now, Nitsana, I read that you are going after Facebook and other social media for allowing their platforms to be used for hate speech. So I remember a few years ago, I don't know if it was you, but it was an organization in Israel who posted an anti-Israel and an anti-Palestinian
Right. It was
cartoon.
us.
It was duplicate. It was you?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it was,
and it was side by side, the exact same thing. Only
yeah, it was 2 pages. One
Yeah.
call to kill Palestinians, one call to kill Israelis. We posted the exact same
Right.
phrases, the exact same images, just with one difference. One's against Israelis, the other one against Palestinians. And then we asked Facebook to take down both pages. Facebook immediately took down the page that called to kill Palestinians. They sent us a fair message saying that this page violates their community standards,
of course.
but they left the Israeli page standing, saying that the page does not violate their community standards.
Yeah.
Hypocrisy, we mentioned.
Okay. Yeah.
Nitsana, it's very disturbing how I think we're frozen here.
No, you're good.
Okay.
Okay.
Nitsana, it's very disturbing how social media platforms seem to be, it almost seems as though they're on the side of terrorists, where they allow anti-Israel remarks, but yet if anything is said with regards to anti-terrorism, people get thrown off. So my question is, how do you litigate with social media platforms for not deleting accounts of terrorists? And what is it that you can do or are doing to make sure that everything is fair? You know, if people want to talk, then everybody can talk. Or if one has to be quiet, the other one has to be quiet.
Yeah. We file lawsuits against Facebook, against Twitter, and against Google in the federal courts in United States. The basis for this lawsuit is a law in the United States named Anti-Terrorism Act. This law prohibits any American citizen or American company provide any sort of services to designated organization. In United States, you are not allowed to provide services or to provide material support to a designated organization. You will carry criminal and civil liability. And this is what we did. We filed a $1 billion lawsuit against Facebook, against Twitter, against Google. The problem is that these social media companies have a defense, comes in the form of the Communication Decency Act. This is Section 230 to the CDA. And this law says that social media services would be immune from anything that their users are posting on their platform. Anybody can put anything they want on Facebook, tweet on Twitter, put any video in YouTube, and these giants will be immune. So when we come and bring our cases, usually they're being rejected, dismissed, just based on this Communication Decency Act. Recently, I was very excited to get a ruling in the Court of Appeal in a case against Google. This is a case on behalf of a young girl that was killed in a Paris attack done by ISIS.
Right.
We sue Google because Google owns YouTube, and between you and I, ISIS would not be even known, recognized without YouTube. Right. We sued them, and in the Court of Appeal, we finally had the minority opinion on our side saying that indeed Google could not be, or YouTube could not be considered as a bulletin board as they claim. They cannot be immune because, as you rightly mentioned, they pick up what words, what videos to screen and what's not.
Correct. They
ban Dennis Prager. They ban conservative speech, conservative videos, whereas they let others to go, and even to incite to violence, which is really insane. So this judge said, with all due respect, the law from 1996 That's not valid anymore. It doesn't make sense. If in 1996 the Congress want to protect the social media giants, today they don't have to do that because the social media giants prove that they can actually monitor this speech. They delete if they want or not delete if they don't want. They have the algorithm to monitor incitement to terrorism. Why should they be immune now? We are 25 years after. And the other judge that did not rule in favor of us did mention that it's time to change the Communication Decency Act. So now finally we have a way, we have a path. We're going to file a motion for a rehearing before larger court, and perhaps for the first time we'll be able to crack this defense.
So it's funny because you mentioned about YouTube has software that detects words. I had a video that was taken down because we had a guest who wrote a column questioning the last elections. So YouTube doesn't allow that anymore.
No.
But ISIS, they can be up there. Nitsana, one of your recent cases was you represented the families of Naftali Frankel, Gilad Shair, and Eyal Yifrach, who were murdered by Hamas in 2014. And I read with shock that the Jerusalem judge ordered Hamas to pay each family basically the equivalent of about $1 million. Now, again, every state, every country has different, limits for how much they award. Here in America, George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minnesota, and his family was awarded $27 million. Here, 3 boys were kidnapped and murdered by Hamas terrorists who actually planned to kill these boys. And yet they walk away with less than $1 million. I hear nightmare stories about Israeli courts and the Supreme Court, which sometimes shock my senses. Can you give us any information about that case?
It was, first of all, it was a terrible story. As we all remember, 3 young kids were kidnapped by 2 Hamas terrorists, and we shot them right when they entered the car, and then hide them in an area near Hebron, and an entire state held its breath for 18 days, looking for the boys until they found the bodies. Because of this kidnap, Israel went into protective edge operation, taking a revenge from Hamas and trying to shut down their terrorists. We filed a lawsuit on their behalf against Hamas, and we expected to receive a similar judgment that we received in the United States. Not in terms of money awards, because we understand, United States has a different scale when they give compensations. You mentioned George Floyd, he got $27 million. I don't think in Israel he would get perhaps maybe $1 million. However, when it comes to terror victim litigation, to terror cases, the United States court grants hundreds of millions of dollars compensations, not because it's typical, just because they want to show their outrage. They want to show how unacceptable it is to come and kill innocent people in act of terrorism. They want to show how disgusted they are from this act. So the note only gives compensatory damages, which is very, very high, tens of millions of dollars. They only also grant punitive damages. And thus you have a large amount of money to quit. We try to teach the Israeli court about what's going on in the United States. And we felt that Israel, being after so many terror attacks, suffering for decades from brutal acts of terrorism, would follow the same path, would show Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, Islamic Jihad, that there is a price to kill Jews, that Jewish blood is not cheap. And they disappointed us. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court came down with a decision, not in our case, in a previous case, giving a different tag of price to people that were killed in terror attacks. And as you mentioned, it comes to less than $1 million per family. This is really disappointing. We are going to appeal this judgment, bring it up before the Supreme Court once again to think maybe they can change their mind. The only court that can change the Supreme Court's ruling is the Supreme Court itself, and we are going to appeal the district court decision because in the end, there must be a state, there must be a statement, you must know, the terror organizations must realize that 75 years after the Holocaust, there is a price to Jewish blood. You cannot kill Jews and go without pay. And with all due respect, $1 million doesn't do anything to Hamas or to the Palestinian Authority, which their budget is $1 billion a year. You want to hurt them, you want to hit them, you want to teach them, you want to tell them not to do it again, give them significant amount that they will learn.
Nitsana, you have been doing so much and are continuing to do in your unique, wise way. But what would you say is your greatest achievement with regard to a case?
I think my greatest achievement, I have several, but I really like the one that we won against the Palestinian Authority in the United States. In 2004, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of 10 families of terror victims. And the case went to discovery, deposition, motion to dismiss, and after 11 years, it finally went to trial, 2015, opened in New York. And we were there. We participated in the trial, 50 days. It was the coldest months of my life in New York. And the common basis for these terror attacks were that they all were perpetrated and done by Palestinian employees, Palestinian people that received salary from the Palestinian Authority, policemen, security guards, other stuff, but they're all under the jurisdiction and the authority of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority came and had a defense. They said, indeed, they were our employees, but they were rogue employees. They did the attacks after work hours. It wasn't our policy to kill Israelis. We didn't encourage them to kill Jews. But when the trial opened, they could not explain the jury. If they were rogue employees, how do you continue paying their salary in the jail until today?
Yeah.
How do you raise them in rank every 3 years? How to pay stipends to the families of the suicide bombers? This is not how you treat rogue employees. This is not when your policy is against killing Jews. When the jury went and came back, they found the Palestinian Authority responsible for all acts of terrorism and gave us a judgment for $655 million. That was a great achievement.
What an achievement. Wow.
Nitsana,
unfortunately, the story didn't end. The Palestinian Authority filed an appeal. They were able to vacate the judgment based on personal jurisdiction. They said, with all due respect, the United States has no jurisdiction over us. We don't work in the United States. We don't present in the United States. We don't have business in the United States. And the courts of appeal agreed with them. The State Department also agreed with them. And when we filed our motion to the Supreme Court, the judgment was still vacated. However, we went to Congress and told them that there is a problem. There is a problem because we litigated this case for 15 years based on a law that they enacted, the Anti-Terrorism Act, that allows American citizens to bring their cases in the United States for a terror attack that happened outside of the United States. It's an extraterritorial jurisdiction law. On the other hand, the Supreme Court found this law to be unconstitutional. So they have to fix the problem. And their way to fix the problem is to reinstate personal jurisdiction. To come and say, if the United States wants to receive continue and receive aid from if the Palestinian Authority wants to continue and receive aid from the Palestinian Authority, they have to agree to their personal jurisdiction.
Okay.
So now we're back in the district court trying to find out whether there is jurisdiction based on this law. I really hope that in the end of the day, the Palestinian Authority will have to pay $655 million to the terror victims. But I already know that the Palestinian Authority leaders could not understand, could not realize, imagine how the little money they gave the terrorists before the attacks, how the support they provided them before the attacks, turned in the end of the day to hundreds of millions of dollars in damages against.
Bela, we're
Thank you, Nitsana. We are out of time. We so much appreciate what you're doing for World Jewry and for giving us of your precious time today. Thank you to vinnews.com for hosting our show, and we thank our audience for tuning in.
Well, thank you, Bela. Thank you, Alan. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
okay.
Thanks for listening to The Definitive Wrap with your hosts, Bela Sebro and Alan Skorsky. Be sure to tell your family and friends they also can listen to The Definitive Wrap on Apple Music, Spotify, Google Play, and your favorite streaming service. See you next time on The Definitive Wrap.